So with that done now, all I'm seeing is this low polygon object that has the UVs applied. You have this 2D texture editor that gives you a way of working in both 2D mode and 3D right here in the very same viewport. You could dock it all the way to the left side and scale this panel up, and now you have a split viewport with your 2D editor on one side and your 3D viewport on the other, with your tools right in the very center. So you may prefer to work that way. And you can save the page layout here. You can store a workspace, store a page layout, and you can retrieve it later on as well if you like. Okay, so you can turn your wireframe on. In this case, you have an option. If in the retopple room you choose to subdivide during the baking process, 3D Coat is going to give you the option when you click on wireframe. It's going to cycle between the original low polygon version that you have in the retopple room and then the one that's subdivided. When you export your model out of 3D Coat, it's also going to give you the option to export the low polygon version or the medium polygon version, the one that you subdivided. So just keep that in mind. So yeah, you can paint here. You also happen to have repeating instances of the same UV texture space. Now, if you're coming from an application where you're working with UV tiles, 3D Coat does give you support for that when you import. In your import dialog, you need to check import UVs as tiles. What 3D Coat is going to do is store the UDIM layout arrangement that you had, and it's going to convert it to UV sets, which is the way it works currently in the application. So you can cycle between the different UV sets. Rather than working with tiles that are spread out, 3D Coat essentially treats it almost like a stack of papers or images, if you will, and they're all stacked in this 0 to 1 texture space. And like a stack of papers or cards, you can only see one at a time, but once more you can cycle between them here. Nevertheless, whenever you're ready to export your model back to your host application, in the export dialog you'll have the option to export UVs as tiles. With that checked, 3D Coat is going to remember the stored UDIM layout, the one that you had when it was incoming, and it's going to restore that to the way you had it. So just thought I would mention that for anyone who is using UV tiles in their application. Whenever you're painting in the 2D texture editor, you'll see live updates even as you're brushing. And then when you're brushing here in the 3D viewport, as soon as you let it from your cursor, let me just go ahead and demonstrate that quickly. I'm going to turn depth and glossiness off, and I'll explain these in just a moment. But I want to paint with just color for now. And as I'm brushing, you can see the changes update as soon as I let up from my cursor. Okay, but let's go over here now. I'll zoom in. Let's just turn wireframe off for the moment. And I need to rotate my model around so you can see that as I'm brushing, 3D Coat's updating it in real time. It's not waiting till I release my cursor. It's actually applying the paint live, even though I'm still applying pressure. Okay, so very cool. Then you can also work with your individual maps. And that brings me to these 3 channels, and you might have a 4th one that's been much requested recently, is your metalness option here to offer a 4th channel. So you might see that here in the future, but right now you have depth, color, and glossiness or roughness, and these reside on any given layer. So on this layer, for example, I could restrict it to just color by disabling depth and glossiness or roughness. And again, as I paint here, that's all I'm going to have on this layer unless I paint, you know, something from one of these other channels onto the same layer. And so you have your parameters here in the toolbar. Your roughness, with a low value, you're actually painting glossiness or higher glossy values. Okay, but if I crank that all the way up to 100%, now I'm actually painting in roughness. So let's talk about the overall layout of the application. In all of these workspaces, with the exception of the render room, you'll have a tool panel on the left-hand side of the interface. And in the sculpt room, retopple room, and the paint room, you'll typically have a layer panel in the lower right-hand side. So you'll have retopple objects layer panel. You'll have, again, in the sculpt room, you have a Vox tree layer panel, and you can create child layers and so on if you want. And in the paint room, you have a layer panel that is located roughly where you'd find it in Photoshop. In fact, most of the paint workspace is designed to be very familiar to anyone with a Photoshop background, including icons at the bottom of your layer panel and so on. You also happen to have layer opacity sliders for each individual channel, as well as your blending modes, which is very much like what you have in Photoshop. The next thing we want to look at is the tool options. So let me relocate that. This is a very important panel because it's much like your attributes panel in Maya or your command panel in 3ds Max, or like panels in other 3D applications where you are modulating the parameters or the attributes of a given tool. So as you can see in 3D Coat, with some tools you won't have any tool options, such as the paintbrush or the airbrush, but other tools you will see options here, even subtools actually. So this color operations tool really is multiple brushes essentially embedded in one. Your freeze brush, your fill tool. This is especially important, and it's very context sensitive, meaning that when you select a specific option, it may open up your panel much more than what you anticipated. So if I go with no noise pattern, you can see there are very few options, but once I click on a given pattern, all of a sudden I see several options here. If I choose a custom tool, then I'll have many more options than a standard procedural option. This is a good tool to use. If you're coming from ZBrush and you're used to using the noise maker there, you have a lot of the same procedural options for creating not only depth but also color as well and things of that sort. Then in the paint room only, you'll have a preview, and this is especially helpful if you use PBR Smart Material. Once you click on a Smart Material the first time, 3D Coat is going to create a curvature map, which it's going to use to drive many of the paint conditions in this menu list. So if you want to do cavity painting, you can apply more paint in the concave or convex areas, more on flat, more on curved, more on lit, more on shadow, and so on. This preview window is going to give you an accurate representation of what the material is going to look like once you begin brushing, or use the fill tool to quickly fill an object, a surface material, or UV island. And if you want, you can paint right through it. Once your cursor goes inside this, 3D Coat assumes you want to temporarily disable the preview, and it allows you to go ahead and start painting through it if you want. Let's go ahead and test this out with a fill tool. All I need to do is click on the object and wait for it to apply the material. There you have it. I'll move that preview window out of the way. Now if I right click on the thumbnail and choose Smart Material Editor, it's going to expose all the parameters and layers for that material. Once you bring your preview window over the top of your object, then it's going to remove that large thumbnail. Once you move it away, it's going to restore that large thumbnail. And you can make it a smaller thumbnail or larger thumbnail or no thumbnail at all. Cancel that. If you hover over one of these, you'll see a larger thumbnail as well, so that's very handy. I should also mention that while the preview options panel is open, your PBR material is active. So when you're done, you want to make sure to close that. Let's move on now to the tweak room, which will make transform or sculpt edits to a model that you have inside the paint room. Your tool options panel will pop up when you select the select transform tool. And it's like having a number of sub-tools built in. You can use this to make regular transform edits or soft selections and so on. And then you have move, which is just like the move tool in the sculpt room. And then beneath that is just some basic sculpting tools that allow you to sculpt just the geometry. And using the depth channel with your paint layers, you can actually sculpt using image maps, as I mentioned, with displacement or normal maps. So you can combine those two well after you've already baked everything from the retopo room to the paint room. This image-based sculpting is especially effective whenever you're doing micro surface level detail, because you're just applying very small surface level details like skin pores and very fine wrinkles or slight surface bumps and things of that sort. And if you want sculpt layer functionality in 3D Coat, this is a platform to use. You can create a layer mask and mask out certain parts of your normal map or displacement map. And again, you can reduce or increase the height of your displacement or normal map relief and so on. I should mention an important note here, and that is Sculpt Layers inside of the sculpt room itself is a long-standing request and it's supposed to be high on Andrew's to-do list. So make sure to keep an eye out for that.